Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest is Peter Tarnoff, who is a visiting fellow at the Institute of International Studies. Peter was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the first Clinton administration and President of the Council of Foreign Relations from 1986 to 1993. From 1983 to 1986, he was Executive Director of the World Affairs Council in San Francisco. From 1961 to 1982, he was a Foreign Service officer with tours of duty in Lagos, Saigon, Bonn, Paris, Lyon, and Luxembourg. He also served as Special Assistant to Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge and to Secretaries of State Cyrus Vance and Edmund Muskie. Peter, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Tell us a little about your past. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in New York City in the late 1930s, and my family lived in Brooklyn until I was 6, at which time we moved to Florida for a year for business reasons, and then came back to New York, where I lived until I was 12. My parents divorced at that time, and my mother married a Canadian, so I then spent the last year of grammar school and high school in Montreal and Quebec, and then went on to Colgate University for my undergraduate work.
And how did your parents shape your character, looking back in retrospect?
Well, they were very nurturing, which was important. But I think that they helped me in a deeper sense in a couple of ways. They were great readers, mainly novels, but some classic historical novels as well. I know that my father prided himself as a young man. Before I was born, he had bought the Harvard 3-yard shelf, as I remember it, of bound books in red covers with novels of the past 300 or 400 years, not only in the English language, but translated some of the great Russian novels, for example. And secondly, although he was a businessman, he really hoped that his son, and I was his oldest son, would go into some form of public service. He thought that it would be wonderful to try to give back to the country something that he and his father, who had immigrated from Russia, had received, and therefore he was very pleased and encouraging when I chose to go into the Foreign Service of the State Department in the early 1960s.
So in this vast library that he had given you, any books that you read when you were growing up that you recall and that really influenced you?
I was quite struck by Hemingway and Faulkner and Sinclair Lewis, Dos Passos at the time. And then the great, for the most part, 19th century Russian novelists, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. But we read, not together as a family unit, reams and reams of novels and would talk about them. And the existence of the shelf in the collection was a fixture that I remember from a very early time in my life, long before I could read, much less absorb what was in it.
And did you travel a lot as a young person?
Not all that much. Certainly not overseas. The first time I left the United States, except for my time in Canada when I was in high school, was in 1956 when I was at Colgate and went to France for a junior year. That was the first time that I left North America. Were
there any mentors that stand out from this period in your life, people who especially influenced you other than your parents?
At Colgate, I majored in philosophy, and there were 2 or 3 quite wonderful teachers of philosophy who convinced me, although they weren't out to persuade me to major in philosophy, but really opened up an intellectual world that I had not known existed. And for quite a while, I thought I wanted to teach philosophy, and I began to prepare a graduate degree in philosophy at the University of Chicago. But I think in terms of impact on the way I thought about the world in my life, the 3 or 4 professors, none of whom are known, but who were at Colgate at that time, had a very, very strong influence. Once I came into government, I was exposed to people of more prominence, but those early years, especially at undergraduate level, were very important to me.
And I guess they must have taught you to think about both what you were saying and what you were writing in a way that became very useful
Yes,
later on.
that's right, exactly. The use of words, the human condition. During my junior year in France in 1956, 1957, I spent a lot of time studying the French Catholic philosophers, but also the existentialists. And I was intensely involved, almost emotionally involved in what I was reading. And it was a difficult choice for me a couple of years later when I had to choose between a career in the State Department, the Foreign Service, or to become a professor of philosophy.
And what pushed you over the edge in one direction as opposed to the other?
The fact that in 1956, 1957, there were events of a momentous nature taking place in the world. This was the time of the Suez Crisis. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of agitation in Europe, the Hungarian uprising as well. And I found myself in Europe at a time when human events and political events were quite dramatic. I think that if I had not been in Europe at all, or certainly during that year, I might have continued on with philosophy, become a philosophy professor, and never thought about the Foreign Service. But being, if not on the spot, close to the place where momentous events were taking place, propelled me in the direction of trying to participate in a modest way in what was happening in the world rather than being a teacher of philosophy.
And this was a time when you could really feel that you could make a difference, actually,
Yes.
by going into the Foreign Service.
That's right.
And also there probably were not the ambiguities about America's role in the world that we all came to experience in later years.
There was a sense of mission, and actually I didn't come into the State Department until the Kennedy administration, so it wasn't as if I made a decision and came right in. And you're right, there was a feeling of mission, of purpose, of knowing what America's role would be in the world, who our friends were, who our enemies were, and as John Kennedy said in his inaugural address, that the country should be prepared to do whatever was necessary to defend democracy around the world, which did not have a practical application at that moment, but soon afterwards in Vietnam and other places, it became apparent that he was serious about this kind of a commitment, and those of us who were coming into government service were very much motivated by it.
Let's talk about foreign policy a little before we get into particular issues and policy areas that you've been intimately involved in. What's unique about the making of foreign policy in a democracy?
I think that, above all, it's a messy process. It's hard to predict. Now, of course, during the time of the Cold War, as you know from your own work and studies, there was an organizing principle with respect to American foreign policy. There was an overriding concern, the threat perceived or real, and I would submit it was very real, from the Soviet Union militarily and ideologically. And therefore, most of what the State Department did or the White House did in foreign affairs turned around the fact that we were at the head of an alliance of, for the most part, free nations which were allied principally to defend our common interests against Soviet encroachments. Even during that period, there was, at various moments, and we saw it during the Vietnam War, for example, intense debate about how this should apply and how far it should go. But it's never been easy to predict a steady course for American foreign policy, the defense of American interests around the world. And of course, since the end of the Cold War, and I know we'll get into this a little later, it's become almost impossible to have anything resembling an organizing principle to guide either politicians or taxpayers in the defense of America's interests overseas. Now,
let's focus in, as we can do this because you're a former philosophy student, and that is on the American adjective there. I mean, one in addition to being a foreign policy and a democracy, there's certain distinctive things about the way the United States does it that you must have had to explain to your colleagues in France and Germany and elsewhere. What stands out now in your mind as enduring qualities that really come out of our history and our culture, that's distinctively American as opposed to just democratic?
That are rather unique.
Yeah.
The first, I think, Harry, and the most striking is the moral character to our foreign policy. Now, I'm not saying this to defend it, because at times it is not as moral as it seems, but a certain sense of altruism, which is part and parcel of the way any president will explain to the Congress and the country what the U.S. is all about. Human rights is one recent example of this. But in the struggle against the Soviet Union, the repression of the Soviet system, not only in Russia itself, but throughout the Warsaw Pact countries, was a very, very strong issue. And you may remember the differences between the United States and some of our principal friends and allies in Western Europe over the plight of the Soviet Jews, for example, during the 70s and early 80s. So there's the moral character.
And even the opposition groups to American policy toward the Soviet Union had human rights concerns about our policies in other parts of the world.
That's right. No, exactly. And that would reflect in opposition to the support that the United States gave sometimes at that period in particular to repressive regimes, authoritarian regimes around the world, in the interest of having them as allies in the overall front against Soviet expansionism in one form or another. So it permeated to a large extent the decisions that we would make internationally and internally. Second was a sense of not wanting to be at the head of an empire in the way some of our good friends in Europe had been during the course of the 19th and part of the 20th century. I don't think there was ever a real inclination on the part of American policymakers after the first war, even less so, but certainly after the second war, to have the U.S. in charge in a direct way. And you may remember the decision to provide considerable aid to Europe, not only Western Europe, the offer was also made to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in the context of the Marshall Plan, was predicated on the requirement not only that these countries come up with a rational plan, but that they do it cooperatively, that the money would be given for what amounted to be a collective effort at reconstruction and development, which some might consider was short-sighted on the part of the United States because, as we're now seeing 50 years later, Europe has developed into a partner but also a competitor to the United States. But we never thought that the United States would be at the head of an empire in a traditional sense, which was quite different. Finally, although it remains a factor in American foreign policy, we were never as mercantile as the traditional European colonial powers. I don't remember any discussion in terms of high policy interests where the economic stake the United States would have was a paramount concern. I'm not saying that it was irrelevant, and we had to find hard-earned taxpayers' dollars to fund a lot of what we were doing during the Cold War, especially the defense budget. But the economic interests of the United States was never a major objective when we came to very large strategic concerns during that period. Economics has subsequently become much more important, of course, as you know.
Now, in what ways did American foreign policy change in some or any of these elements, during the period of your career? Because you go back to the beginning of the Kennedy administration through the Clinton administration, and really are there change in courses on some of these matters with regard to the enduring features of U.S. foreign policy? They pretty much remain the same.
No, I think there were two. There were many course corrections, but I think there were two very pronounced changes. The first was in and around the Vietnam War and the Watergate experience, where for the first time in our history, the primacy of the executive branch in general and the president in particular came under very close scrutiny with regard to leadership of the country in foreign affairs and defense matters. And it culminated, of course, in the growing pressures which led to the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam and the subsequent overthrow of the non-communist regime in the South. And that was, as you know, in our history, the first time that there had been a very broad-based, popular challenge to the president's leadership in foreign and defense matters. And that, of course, had its own consequences. The second substantial change occurred after the disappearance of the Soviet Union and the evaporation of the Cold War. And here, there were many effects. But to me, the most dramatic in terms of the making of American foreign policy was that it was no longer possible to have a coalition of thought, not always a consensus on policy, but a coalition of thought that was fairly stable in this country and outside with regard to where the priorities were. And that's why there emerged shortly afterwards a debate in the country about whether or not there could be a successor to the late 1940s doctrine created by George Kennan of the so-called containment theory, where the prime responsibility of the United States would be to contain the expansionism of the Soviet Union and its surrogates. There was no longer a simple way to define America's interests in the world, and therefore on issue after issue, case by case, domestically and internationally, we would have to decide what our interests were and assemble a coalition which sometimes had very different members depending on the issue in ways that simply weren't necessary during the Cold War.
Now, a lot of times in the literature on foreign policy, there invidious comparisons are made with the architects, between what the architects of the post-Cold War world were able to do, and in comparison with the present muddling through that we witness. Let's talk a little further about really the differences there. The wise men, as they're called, really had experienced the failure of the aftermath of World War I, and that propelled them to come up with a vision, for the world. Right. In the recent period after the end of the Cold War, were we too obsessed with Vietnam and the lessons of that experience?
Let me answer the question in two ways. The first part of my answer will refer to what I think represents a fair response from, at this moment, the only still surviving member of the original wise men, and that is George Kennan, who came to Washington to meet several of us in early 1993 after the Clinton administration took office, and we talked to him about just that issue. Was the immediate post-World War II period one of great strategic vision, and are we, all of us, including people who were just coming back into government, unable to muster the vision and the courage to have this kind of broad strategic sweep? And in his own understated philosophical way, he told us not to worry about it. That the period immediately after the Second World War was one where there emerged a quite real challenge to American and Western interests, both security and economic. And it was easier at that time to mobilize support around essentially a defensive idea. He recognized, as we all do, that you simply did not have that kind of challenge. There were some people even at the time, and I was not one of them, but I will mention them anyway, who developed a certain nostalgia for the Cold War because matters were simpler. It was possible to get more of a commitment from our own Congress and country and from our friends and allies than turned out to be the case after the Cold War had evaporated. And we can go into the comparatives as well. I have no nostalgia at all for the Cold War period. But I think that it was, in some respects, more cosmically threatening because you faced at least the chance of the destruction of the planet in a way you don't now, but simpler in terms of the way we organize ourselves and defend American interests overseas. So I think the muddling through, and I don't want to be defensive about it, having been in government myself, is probably necessary as long as there is a free and open debate in this country, as I think is happening, over where we should be or whether we should be involved, and if so, how much should we be willing to do, and how much do we require others participate in terms of troops on the ground, political influence, moral suasion, and obviously economic assistance. How much do we want to do, and make those decisions as these cases present themselves, or as the government or the Congress decide that there's an interest out there that America should take advantage of it. But I understand that there is a certain feeling that a doctrine as it emerged 50 years ago made it simpler to define priorities and marshal resources than is the case now.
Now, because we're conducting foreign policy in a democracy, the public discussion, the public debate is very important. In his article on the enlargement of NATO, Mark Danner retells the story of Vandenberg's and the Senate leaders meeting with President Truman prior to, I think, his the Truman Doctrine speech, and Vandenberg, to paraphrase Danner, told the president to scare the American people, basically. So are you suggesting that in this environment, if you still wanted to do that, it's harder to do? But another way of saying it is that the discussion is now so complex that you have to draw on different support from different groups, that it becomes very difficult to mobilize public opinion on particular issues?
Well, if I understand the point that Mark Danner was making, what Vandenberg was saying, that there is an overriding threat to American well-being and the interests of our friends, many of our friends overseas. And the way to get the American people to react is to be very stark about it and explain what will happen if we don't do something. There is nothing, despite the real threats and dangers, including in the security field, which now exist, there is nothing that big and that broad that is out there now. So therefore, when we think about our policy towards the so-called rogue states, North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, just to mention three, there can be legitimate differences of opinion with regard to tactics. I think that most people would hope that sooner rather than later, the governments of these states would become part of an international movement towards cooperation, reconciliation with neighbors and things like that. But how you get there from here tends to be quite complicated. I don't think that the average person, by the way, is incapable of understanding it. I think a good deal of the so-called mystique about foreign policy was perpetrated by people who wanted to keep the debate as closed as possible. And I may have even been of that persuasion myself when I was in government, at least some years ago. But the factors that you might apply to one case will not necessarily apply to another, and the levers that we have will not apply universally. And even in the 2 or 3 cases that I mentioned, we will have both domestic and, more importantly, international supporters who will line up with us on some of these cases and issues and oppose us on others. So that's the nature of the complication. The fact that you don't have a stable domestic support group and you don't have a constant coalition in favor of what you're doing internationally.
Why do our current political leaders seem to be less self-confident in taking their case about particular issues to the American public. It's almost as if one feels sometimes that they shy away from a public debate. But is that maybe not the case, and is it maybe the fact that the government is not clear about what it wants to do in a particular issue?
I'm not sure, and of course I was, as you indicated, part of the first Clinton administration, so again, I may not be the best person to be objective on that issue, but with regard to the major strategic and foreign policy choices that we made during that period, including the enlargement of NATO issue, I think that we were very clear about what we wanted. Now, it is true that in certain cases, and I'm thinking of Bosnia and Haiti in particular, after we became involved, the situation changed. And what we thought at the beginning of our policy, let's say towards Haiti, which was essentially to bring international political and economic pressure to bear on the junta, which had overthrown the democratically elected government, was not working. And therefore, after a year, the president brought together his senior advisors and said, we still want to change there, but the sanctions policy is not working. We have to now begin to think of intervention. And of course, we were very close to an actual intervention in Haiti, and the situation involved in Bosnia and ultimately in Kosovo that way as well. But there really was an open debate about all of these issues. I testified myself enough before Congress and appeared enough on television in defense of administration policies on all of these issues to know that the matter was very, very openly discussed. In all of these cases, there remained, even after the intervention, considerable unhappiness in certain quarters of political and public opinion in this country. But I would defend the proposition that the issues were well aired, even if there remained sometimes a very significant minority of people who were unhappy with what the policy choices taken were.
Let's look now at this problem of intervention that we're talking about in more detail. And your career really covers a very interesting cycle in American diplomacy, beginning with you were in Vietnam, an advisor, an aide to Ambassador Lodge, and then in Europe with him. And then when you were assuming roles both at the World Affairs Council and at the Council of Foreign Relations, was a period when America, so to speak, came back in the Persian Gulf War, basically, and then in the Clinton administration to Bosnia and a kind of a reluctance to intervene, but then intervention and then intervention in Kosovo. Tell us a little about this landscape and how it has changed, how you changed personally in your thinking, and how you think the American debate changed about our sense of what we could do on these particular issues when we intervened in a place like Vietnam, in a place like Bosnia, and so on.
Well, during that period, of course, Harry, there were 4 or 5 critical moments. And let me try to identify them and then go back and talk a little bit about the evolution in my thinking and general consideration of policy people in this area. There was the victories in the Second War, 1945. There was the Korean War, where we lost about as many people as we did in Vietnam. Not quite as many, but still 50, 55,000 people. And where there was a resolution, but not a triumph, because a truce was established in 1953. You then got into the Vietnam period, where not only were American interests not as defined by the administration, not by a majority of the American people, it turned out, but where the administration suffered a defeat, whether it was a military defeat on the ground or a political defeat. The U.S. objective in Vietnam to preserve a non-communist entity in the South obviously failed, and the southern part of the country was taken over by the North in 1975. The next major event was the Persian Gulf War. And then we got into the various interventions that I've talked about earlier during the Clinton administration. So you've had, over a period of now close to 55 years, quite an evolution of peaks and valleys, so to speak. In terms of where we are now, I think that what any president, this one or his successor, has to be ready to do is to have what amounts to be a very flexible arsenal of tools at his disposal to intervene. And by the way, there's a tendency, and I do it as well, so I'm correcting more myself than anyone else, to think of intervention primarily in a military sense. That's really not the case. We intervene very actively, politically and diplomatically, economically, morally. We organize in the UN and NATO and elsewhere international coalitions, and the military arm is the last recourse with regard to intervention, and something that no president will want to use unless he thinks it's absolutely necessary. But with regard to the intervention doctrines that we're hearing about, and some debate in this country, which may become rather intense in the next years, about whether the United States should involve itself in what is called humanitarian interventionism, where we don't have a lot of strategic interests. Our economic concerns are very small. We don't have a large political constituency in this country pushing the administration to act. But there are thousands or tens of thousands of people who are being either forced to move or victimized or killed by a regime for its own ethnic reasons. And that's, of course, what we've been seeing around the world, unfortunately, in recent years. How much should the United States become involved? I would defend the proposition that we do have an interest in preventing such catastrophes. And therefore, it's incumbent on the United States as a moral nation, but also as a nation with enormous experience in the diplomatic arts, as well as the military, our military capabilities, to involve ourselves with others in the region as much as possible to try to bring about a cessation of these kinds of hostilities and human catastrophes. Now, how we do it depends a lot on circumstances. And it's obviously easier in places like Europe, where you have NATO, where you have the European Union, where you have the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. You've got major institutions, you've got allies with comparable experiences diplomatically and militarily, economically to our own, to bring about a group of countries being willing to intervene. It's tougher in other parts of the world, and there may be places where this is happening, where the President and the Congress of the country decides that the cost in terms of lives and resources is too great. But should we, in virtually every case, at least take a hard look at it? I would say emphatically yes.
Yeah, one could argue from Berkeley, not being in Washington, that there's a volatile mix that seems to be emerging in some of these situations. And I would not relate this to a particular case, but just a kind of an ideal type. And that is, what we have is a dictator or a human rights violator who's in essence turning against his own people systematically, and that we're confronted with a situation where we have to decide whether to act. And because of the remnants of the Vietnam syndrome, there is a real concern on the part of our political leaders to use the involvement of American troops, and rightfully so. And so what then is added to this volatile mix is weapons of high technology which allow us to essentially fly very high and drop bombs, or if we don't go the military route, to impose sanctions, which then become less a burden on the regime and more on the people and so on. And what I'm not is faulting any one side, but just saying it's a very complex situation if you factor in domestic American politics, the realities of the situation, and the instruments of high technology weaponry.
Absolutely. Each of the tools that you mentioned, and even some others, the moral tools, are not like laser surgery, where you can be sure that you're going to go in and do the job with a very high rate of success because it's a tried and proven technology, as we're seeing in modern medicine today. And therefore, you have to learn from experiences, just to take the two examples that you gave. I think that the rather indiscriminate use of economic sanctions has turned out to be ineffective in many, many cases. And as you also mentioned, and I agree with this, in some cases more harmful to the population than to the leadership. And we've seen this in Iraq. We've seen it to a certain degree in Serbia, where the sanctions are not as drastic, but fairly substantial, even before the Kosovo events. And yet the country was not under enormous pressure at all because they found ways to avoid the sanctions. This said, if the sanctions are voted by the United Nations Security Council and pretty well observed by most countries, I think it's not only an economic tool, it's a political and moral tool to get an international statement of concern. What bothers me more, because they are not effective and sometimes highly provocative, is when the United States indulges in widespread unilateral sanctions where only the United States is imposing them, or when we have adopted what are called extraterritorial sanctions, which involve the United States applying its own law to foreign companies and foreign governments overseas, which cause an enormous political wrangle between the United States and those affected countries. So I think that is a major problem. With regard to the military, the use of military means, I know that we are still, and this was certainly what you had in mind, looking at the consequences of the Kosovo campaign. I must say that I believe that if the United States had gone in on the ground, given the way our very effective and well-trained military has to operate, there would have been not only Allied casualties, which we have an interest in avoiding, of course. Every responsible president or commander-in-chief would want to do that, but substantially more Serbian casualties than was the case. Because based on the Vietnam experience and then the Persian Gulf War, the Gulf War, the United States military will always want to have overwhelming force in order to defend itself. And that means that there would have been an enormous military effort concentrating on Kosovo, but also applying to Serbia itself. So while the casualties were high and there was collateral damage, I firmly believe that the military casualties on the other side would have been greater, and you probably would have had even greater collateral damage if the Allied forces had gone in on the ground. So the debate is not as simple as some would make it out to be, I'm afraid.
As U.S. foreign policy adjusts to this much more fluid world and operates on a different set of parameters than was the case after World War II, the role of things like the World Affairs Council and the Council on Foreign Relations becomes very important. Now, one of the things that we have to address is what exactly is the role, especially of the Council of Foreign Relations, because as you know, there is a conspiratorial tenor in a lot of our popular culture with shows like The X-Files and so on. And so out there is sort of the notion that the Council does something different than what it probably does. So tell us how an organization like the Council sort of shapes the agenda, and then at the same time how organizations like the World Affairs Council are useful for sort of mobilizing, well, not mobilizing public opinion so much as educating the public about what's before us.
Yes. Well, I'm smiling because when I sat in the chair of the Chief Executive Officer of the Council on Foreign Relations and would read some of the theories and conspiratorial reports about how the Council was running, if not the world, at least the U.S. government, I would sometimes sit back and close my eyes and say, would that were the case that I would have this kind of power. And,
Right.
and there was a lot of absolutely unfounded speculation about the role of the Council. It is true that during the period that you referred to earlier, during the post-World War II period, and even during the Second War, when foreign policy was made by a much more limited number of people. Certain organizations, including the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, probably did play, at least intellectually, quite a considerable role. For example, during the course of the war, the Council did not a secret study, but a discreet study on behalf of the government to try to assess what the forms might be that the United States should favor with regard to international organizations after the war. And much of the thinking, the preliminary thinking about the formation of the United Nations was done at the Council on Foreign Relations and somewhere else. So I think at that point its role and influence was probably greater. The one thing that's happened to leap 55 years into the current period a bit abruptly is that it is no longer the province of the Council on Foreign Relations or the World Affairs Council of Northern California in San Francisco to have as much of an exclusive hold on the way people are dealing with foreign policy. And the simple answer to the simple reason for this is that foreign policy has come to mean, in its new forms and permutations, a lot of what people are doing naturally anyway in the course of their normal lives and professions. Oftentimes when I speak to students, including here at the University of California at Berkeley, I ask a group of even undergraduates who are unclear about exactly what their professional choices might be, can they imagine having a professional activity which does not have a very high international content of some point? And there are usually only 10 or 15% aspiring poets or people who want to do individual research who will raise their hands, because the others begin to think that whether they're in the sciences or the arts or the social sciences, government service, the media, university life, business, labor, they are going to have an international component to what they're doing. And it's not only that businesses themselves have vast international operations, all of the major professional activities have connections around the world. So therefore, the traditional organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations and the World Affairs Council have got to broaden their base considerably so as to help educate and form people who come at international relations, not because they spend a junior year in France the way I did when I was 20, but because they find themselves in a professional setting where knowledge of the world is a requirement, not because they like French food or enjoy Thailand and Singapore for travel, but because their professional lives are tied up with a broader universe. And it's quite a challenge, by the way, to do this. I think many of these organizations, including the two that I've mentioned, are doing it well. But the band has stretched enormously wide. And to bring people in, one of the most fascinating exercises at, let's say, the Council on Foreign Relations is to pick a country, whatever the country is, let's say India, and to bring people in who come at India from very different professional perspectives, all of the activities that I mentioned beforehand, and have them in the room talking about India from their own personal or professional perspective. It's like a kaleidoscope. All of those pieces are held in a contained space which is focusing on a country, in this case India, but they are seeing it very differently and having people understand how rich the array of interests are and how beneficial it is for them to understand not only their particular focus, but the views of others who are also interested in that country and sometimes working in that country is, I think, the challenge that all of these organizations, and I'm sure universities, have now.
So that what you're saying is that as the global society has become more muscular, more important, that what governments do may over time become less important, and so that the traditional notion of foreign policy as conducted by the state will be of less salience, except maybe in the case of a threat of a terrorist attack or of war or something like that.
I agree. Yeah. I agree. It's difficult to see that because the headlines usually involve terrorist attack or international catastrophes, which are the province of government. But take economics, for example, and the decisions that not even major corporations make, although there are some of them as well, but individual investors or bond traders will make every day when they decide where they should put their money and how much should go here and how long should it stay in light of sometimes pure political or social developments in a country, means that unless governments, like the United States government in particular, are willing to put huge sums of public funds into the mix, which of course they are not willing to do because all of us wouldn't want them to do it at this point in our history, the private sector can make what amounts to be enormously important decisions, at least with regard to the economies of these countries. And insofar as the economic issues around the world, like in the United States, are of rising importance, and citizens who are participating more actively in the governance of their countries in places where they've not known democracy in the past think of themselves as economic entities as well as political people, they are making choices which confront governments with realities, but which the governments can't change. If the international investor community decides to pull out of country X, there's very little that most governments or international financial institutions can do. And this is a new source of unfocused, raw power that's not political and not directed, but can make or break governments literally overnight.
So does government and governments acting with each other assume a new role in kind of regulating those things that work negatively either against a particular country or the common good? Is that more of a possibility for the future than has been the case in the past?
I think governments will try more, but I think governments will be less and less successful at it. Just on economic issues, for example, as we were saying before, a government which, including the U.S. government, which really doesn't want the American business community to participate at all in country X, Iraq or Iran, let's say, can pass legislation or executive orders which prohibit this activity. Now, it's one thing to do it in Iraq where you have the United Nations Security Council resolution. It's another thing to do it in Iran where you do not have universal sanctions, and therefore, like in Cuba, the rest of the world is going ahead and trading with this country. So you get to the question of what the effectiveness is of government action. With regard to making positive investments in countries, I've been involved, and I know it's still going on, with government efforts to interest the private American economic leadership in going to countries and making investments. Not because the government is interested in the well-being of American companies, although of course they are, but primarily because they want, for political and strategic reasons, a greater U.S. presence in these countries, and they want to shore up the foundation of the regime and sometimes of the leaders themselves. And this means that the administration will call on the private sector to do that. The private sector is increasingly inclined to resist that kind of pressure unless the economic figures are valid. It's quite rare in our day and age that a publicly held company with transparent financial records, which of course we have under our system, will, to me it's inconceivable, Harry, that the CEO of a major company can go to his shareholders and say that they have made an investment in country X because it's in the U.S. national interest for geostrategic or political reasons. Now that's a bit of a caricature, but I think I'm trying to make the point that the ultimate levers, at least with regard to American capital, and given the fact that our assistance budget has been driven down so steadily and dramatically in the past year, are held by people who are in boardrooms and not in government departments.
I heard you say earlier that the idealism of the young Peter Tarnoff, fresh from his major in philosophy, was channeled into government service, by the call of a president. how can we channel the idealism today? I don't mean direct it, but in other words, where will students find an outlet for their idealism as they want to grapple with international issues, they want to make a difference, as you said you wanted to make a difference? Will they be doing that more in non-governmental organizations, environmental groups, and so on?
I think the opportunities are much greater now than they were 35 years ago when I came into government, because not only do you no longer have the overarching threat to the destruction of the planet, you have, as you were suggesting, Harry, other opportunities. You have non-governmental organizations, you have businesses doing exceptionally creative and inventive work, you have the media, you have university people who are traveling overseas and spending some time as Fulbrighters or exchange professors or students overseas. And you also have people in the arts and culture who can live and work overseas and invite their counterparts to this country a lot more easily than was the case before, when you had essentially blocks of countries that were identified on one side or another of the Great Divide. Now, there are still problems and enormous dangers, but I think the terrain is much more open to the kind of idealism and creativity that these young people might have than was the case when you had a rather rigid ideological and military division between those who were on one side and those who were on the other.
We know that you prepared for your service through philosophy. Looking to the future, how would you suggest that students prepare themselves? What sort of skills do they need to acquire? What sort of training should they have?
Well, I think the only lesson that I learned, which might still apply many years later, is that unless they are interested in area studies, which is a very legitimate discipline, so that they really know that they want to be acquainted with the language and the culture and the governments and the history of a certain area, or certain peoples in a certain area, in which case they should do just that. Or they want to become academic theoreticians to a certain degree on international affairs, which is also a legitimate undertaking, of course, especially in a university setting like we are now. I think that if they still want to be internationalists, they should follow their professional interest first. Because, as I indicated before, whatever they do, wherever their professional interest and training takes them, they will have an opportunity to become international. And the international extension of their professional life should take place after they have gotten the education, the training, and the position in the economy or wherever it is to branch out afterwards. And as I say, it's very difficult for me to imagine a profession where they would not have this opportunity.
Looking back at your very distinguished career, any lessons that you would like us to draw from this distinguished service in government and the non-governmental sector?
Well, taking a bit of exception to your characterization of this as distinguished,
okay.
I guess that maybe an example of luck, which I referred to before, at least as far as I was concerned, and that was being in a place where I was quite motivated to have an international career in the State Department, simply because I was in Europe at the time, and not to underestimate the effect of opportunity and luck and chance of traveling is very important. The other thing that we have uniquely in the United States, which I have relished during my international service in the public and private sector, is the ability to come in and out of government. As you know, in virtually all of the foreign bureaucracies, if you go into the diplomatic service as a young person, you are there for life, and then if you leave it, you never come back, and few leave it because it's stimulating and there are all sorts of career incentives to remain there. But I have now had two incarnations in government and two incarnations out of government. And whether or not I have a third assignment in government is something that I can't predict. But I think it's quite stimulating and mutually reinforcing for us, given the diversity of opportunities we have in our country and culture, to move in and out of government so that ideally, and I can't say I've done it perfectly in every respect, you can draw strength from the government service and the mission that you're involved in, but have a better understanding while you're in government of what is available outside and what, as we were saying a moment ago, the real growing strengths are in terms of the international connections that can only be done in the private sector under our system. So this shuttling back and forth, not opportunistically, but on a fairly regular basis, I think is quite an opportunity that we have in this country, and that I would recommend to anyone who will try it and take a bit of a risk, because you can't always be as sure-footed when you're hopping back and forth every 5 or 10 years as you would be if you followed a more straight-line career.
Peter, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing these insights with us about U.S. foreign policy. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.